This is John Wilkerson from thewiredhomeschool.com, and you're listening to Beyond the Box with your hosts, Steve Sensenig and Raborn Johnson.
Hi, I'm Raborn Johnson.
And I'm Steve Sensenig.
And this is Beyond the Box.
Here's your invitation to explore life outside the box of institutional religion.
This is a place where there are no walls to restrict our search for truth as we embrace the ambiguity of defining our life in Christ.
So unbuckle your seatbelt,
recline your chair,
throw caution to the wind, and get ready for the ride that is
Beyond the Box. Welcome back, everybody, to Beyond the Box. It is great to be back with you today. Today, we're going to be starting part 2 of a 3-part series that we've entitled The Slavery of Death. So I suggest if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, that you go back and do that now, as I think it's going to make a lot more sense if you listen to all 3 parts in order. Now, this 3-part series, The Slavery of Death, is a very, condensed version of a 31-part series on Richard Beck's blog entitled Experimental Theology that he did on the slavery of death. Dr. Richard Beck is the chair of the psychology department at Abilene Christian University, and in this 31-part series entitled The Slavery of Death, he really brings together a lot of things for me that tended not to click in the past. It's just really a great interface between psychology and theology, taking the work of people like Ernest Becker and Walter Wink and Arthur McGill and tying it in with things like Eastern Orthodox theology, and just really helps to make a lot of things mesh together for me. So I hope you guys are going to enjoy it half as much as I enjoyed recording it. Richard, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I look forward to many more conversations in the future. I'm going to get out of the way now so that you can enjoy this conversation with Dr. Richard Beck. This one's entitled The Denial of Death. Well, everybody, welcome back to Beyond the Box. I am so excited again to have with me Dr. Richard Beck from Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. Welcome once again to the podcast. We didn't scare you off the first time. That's always a good sign.
No, glad to be back.
In the first podcast, we kind of started talking about your blog series, The Slavery of Death, which I think is it 31 posts? Is that right?
I think it ended up being about 31 posts.
It ended up being 31 posts. You know, I think when it was like 30, I printed it out, and then 2 or 3 days later after I printed, I saw another one. I was like, oh, man.
The series never ended.
I'm like, I'm going to have to just keep printing here. But, oh, my gosh, if you keep putting out stuff of this quality, you just keep throwing out those posts as much as you want to. In the first one, we kind of set up the problem of not only that it's not so much just the fear of death, but that there's a slavery to the fear of death. That and we talked a lot about the difference between the Orthodox and Protestant views of how the Protestants tended to go with Augustine's understanding of original sin versus the Orthodox view of ancestral sin. Mm-hmm. And we kind of talked about that the problem was our mortality fears.
Right.
The idea that it's not just sin that leads to death, but it's actually death that leads to sin, and that because of those mortality fears, we get into this Darwinian struggle for survival that makes us kind of, almost by necessity in some ways, be selfish and kind of self-serving. Mm-hmm. So today, we're going to get into a lot here. We've got a lot of material that we want to cover, but we've dubbed this episode The Denial of Death, after Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, which you're pulling heavily from in the Slavery to the Fear of Death series. And when you started talking about this, I think this is around part 11, I believe, in your series. When you started talking about this, you introduced a term, the pornography of death. Mm-hmm. And I found that really interesting, the pornography of death, because I've never really thought about how even our language, the way we talk, even the words that we consider curse words, that's always been kind of a mind-boggling thing for me.
Yeah.
I've always wondered, why are certain words off limits in the English language. Why are we bothered by some words and not by others? And you really show in the series that there's this thing where we try and hide death, that our fear of death is not just an outward Darwinian struggle where there's not enough bread to go around and so we have to fight other people, but because we live in a first world country especially, that those fears become neurotic. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of unpack that for us?
Yeah, I can start with the pornography of death. That's a term. I believe I might not get his name right. Jeffrey Gore wrote a kind of influential essay, and in it he basically makes the argument that death has become illicit. It's nothing that we don't like. Pornography, we don't want to bring these things up in polite company. And part of that is just because how the changes in the modern world, our relationship to death has changed dramatically. The food industry has separated us from the death that's associated with our food products, and so we don't see the animals killed. So the food doesn't look like an animal anymore. A chicken McNugget doesn't look anything like a chicken,
is a chicken McNugget even a chicken?
Right. So even our food doesn't even remind us of death. It doesn't look like anything, so we can pretend it just kind of comes out of nowhere. One of my favorite little anecdotes I tell is how we used to die in our homes. And the wakes would be in our homes, and we would be buried in the cemetery next to our churches, and the churches doubled as schoolyards. And so we would walk through or by cemeteries on the way to church and on the way to school. The city meetings would be in that building as well. But when modern hospitals got invented, people started dying in hospitals, and because of that, people didn't know where to take the dead bodies. It seemed strange to bring them back home, so they would. So instead of taking them home, they you saw the rise of the funeral home. So the bodies were taken to the funeral home. So we were not dying at home anymore. We weren't. The wakes were not in the home. They took place somewhere else. And eventually, what happened is we renamed the parlors. I think it was Women's Day magazine. Said that we should name the parlors the living room, and so the dead had even been expelled from our homes, and so in a sense, with all of these changes from food to the funeral industry to modern medicine, what has happened in the world today is we can kind of pretend that death doesn't exist and live with this illusion that we have all the time in the world and that we're somewhat immortal. And obviously that's a fantasy, but so much of modern American life particularly kind of exploits or tries to capitalize on that illusion, from dyeing our hair to the cosmetic industry to the plastic surgery to the belief that if you could just drink filtered water, you'll live forever. I mean, there's all these kinds of things where we think, that somehow we're going to crack this thing and death could be avoided. And so the pornography of death is just kind of just a nice label to describe kind of the modern culture of death avoidance that characterizes most Americans. And so what happens is, like you said, our slavery to death is not a primal fear anymore. But it is more neurotic. It is more an underlying anxiety that has been largely repressed, but is still churning beneath the surface and creating a lot of still sinful activity. But this might be harder to put our finger on the slavery of death in the modern context, because it seems like our technology and our wealth has insulated us from death. And so therefore we think we got it licked. But the argument that people like Ernest Becker makes in his book is that we haven't really got it licked. It's still there, rumbling beneath the surface.
It's almost like we buy into the lie of immortality. You mentioned this in the series, that it's almost like, especially in America, especially in first world countries, we almost look at death as unnatural, as if we're surprised that someone died. And yet, studies still show that 1 out of 1 people die, 10 out of 10 still die.
Right.
So, it's just, it's almost like with what you're saying with the funeral homes, the hospitals, that that it's an attempt to completely drive death away from our consciousness, completely out of our minds. You had a couple of quotes that I wanted to mention in light of that. You said we are enslaved to death because we can't see what is going on. We can't see how we are serving death every single day. So with this neurotic fear of death, how does that play out into the idea that we really are serving death every single day?
Yeah, and I think that's where the work of Ernest Becker really comes in. And so Becker's argument is that the human predicament is impossible, because we have the conscious capacity to realize that moment by moment, day by day, we're inexorably being drawn towards our ultimate demise. And that obviously, but that then triggers in us the animal instinct for survival. And so we're kind of caught in between those two. And so the only way to resolve that dilemma, according to Becker, is to some way attach our lives to something permanent, something that might transcend or outlast us. And so his argument is that what happens is cultures get invented, value systems, ways of life get invented, and these cultures are ultimately, defined by creating kind of transcendent goods or projects that I can attach my life story to. And when I attach my life story to these things, I get a sense of permanence, transcendence. My life, is the efforts of my life are going to outlive myself. And then, so what happens is that as I go through my day, as I work and I monitor my self-esteem in relation to, my paycheck, or I'm comparing myself to other people, that at the end of the day, why I'm engaging in those comparisons, why I'm caught up in that rat race, is, according to Becker, driven by this anxiety that my life won't matter. And so my quest for meaning and significance is at root driven still by an anxiety. Now, I'm not aware of that. All I'm aware of is that I'm feeling better about myself or worse about myself in relation to how my culture defines the good life in that sense. And so yeah, we have to get to the work of Ernest Becker to understand how my day-to-day, evaluations of myself and my life are actually being driven by death anxiety.
Yeah, this cultural hero system that Ernest Becker talks about, I found that really fascinating, because it's like, we all, even as Christians, we've been taught that we were made for meaning and significance. And so it's almost like there's this bait that's even given us within the church to seek meaning and significance. But what we don't realize is that's always defined by someone other than God.
Right.
You talk about, and you kind of get into this a little bit later in the series. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm probably going to murder this term, but the deus ex machina, I guess, which is a Latin term, basically is that how you say it? Is that?
I'm not, the deus ex machina, I'm not sure.
Something like that. I guess it's something that Peter Rollins really went after.
I was asking my friend who's better at Latin and things like that about that, but yeah, I don't have a lot.
But kind of the idea is that there's a God that we create, that's totally a creation of our own culture. This, I mean, especially in America, you can see this, and especially maybe even more so in the South than anywhere else, because of the patriotic overlays that get thrown into church. 4th of July Sunday, you've got the Christian flag and the American flag side by side, and tributes to the veterans and all of this kind of thing, so that we almost get this God that's a God and country type God. So what we end up doing is this God begins to do the same thing the culture's doing in giving us defined ways of finding meaning and significance that are really just part of the larger cultural system.
Right.
So, in light of that, how do we kind of, and I want you to talk about that, but in talking about that, how do we avoid that? How do we avoid kind of being duped by this search for meaning and significance and find actual true meaning and significance. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about that.
Becker uses the term heroics. In more recent psychological research, they've kind of traded that in for the term self-esteem. And so in the series, I'll often kind of go back and forth. Becker's talk about heroics, but probably most of us would just define that term as a self-esteem, my general sense of leading a meaningful, significant life. But yeah, his argument is that we all want to be significant and be a hero in a certain sense, but obviously, how do you define that? And it's obviously the culture steps in and says it gives you narratives and meaning structures and says, this is, so when you're talking about America, right? We often use the term, these are our heroes and these are our exemplars and these are, but we also talk about, the everyday heroism. I mean, we're in the middle of election year here. And you'll hear from both candidates, Romney and Obama, kind of the mythology of our country. And it's not always the men and women in the military. It's not always the police officers, the firemen, although that was really big after 9/11. But it's the everyday heroism, right? That the guy that gets up every day and he packs his lunch pail, and so there's that kind of American work ethic and the small town values. And so we have these meaning systems. And the idea is that I just imbibe that like the air around me. And if I participate in those ways of life, I can look back and say to myself, and my friends and family members in my culture steps in and says that, hey, that's a life well lived. And it's not necessarily, Becker's saying, it's not necessarily saying that those aren't lives well lived. His argument is that there's a kind of existential vulnerability that sits at the bottom of it. That for I think for some of us that are kind of more existential people, we're aware of that. We get a sense that I put my whole life into this, business, or I put my whole life into building this company, or I've done all of this work, I've published, or I've created all this stuff, but you get kind of the voice of Ecclesiastes sneaking in, going, what is any of this going to last? Is it, I mean, I was really anxious and I thought this was the most important thing. And I think there's moments in our lives when we face death, when we age. We were talking about our kids earlier. When you look it through the eyes of a new generation, there's and sometimes it's just kind of the late at night when you're alone, you just kind of think, what's the point of it all? So there's a thinness there. And I think Becker thinks, you might not ever get underneath the surface of this. You can go pretty much from the cradle to the grave fairly oblivious that you were engaged in that kind of pursuit. But there's more pernicious consequences we'll get into in a little bit. All that to say is, I think the biblical language for what we're talking about is the principalities and powers. Yeah. That there are kind of, and I kind of rely on the work of William Stringfellow a little bit here, and his argument is that all of these meaning-making structures, from businesses to ideologies to beliefs and value systems, really are just agents of death, because we're attaching ourselves to these things to feel like we can transcend death. But Becker's argument is that these things are a part of the creation as well. I'll give you a concrete example of this. Like I work at a university, and obviously when the university gets together, we have kind of a mythology about who we are and what we do and how everything we do is the most significant and amazing things. But any corporate entity is going to get together and kind of fill you with the kind of mythology, and the idea here is that if you serve us, your life will have made a difference. And
can I interject an example here? There's just like the perfect example. I was actually sitting, it's so funny. I was sitting at a restaurant that will remain unnamed for lunch one day in the last week. And I was sitting there reading your series on the slavery of death and kind of going over the notes for us to do these interviews. And I had my earbuds in, listening to some music, some background music, but I could still hear that at a table kind of across the way, there was like a manager's meeting at this fast food restaurant. And it was just talking about the meaning. I'm going to laugh, and I don't mean to, this is not this is not a put down to anybody, but it's just a perfect example of how we do this. They were talking about the meaning and significance of selling, I just can't even hardly get it out, of selling an extra tray of nuggets a day. And the fact that at the end of the year, they would have $25,000 added to their bottom line. And that was supposed to get everybody like jazzed up and man, this makes it worth my day to come to work. And I just sat there, here I am reading like stuff about Ernest Becker and William Stringfellow. And I'm just kind of going, oh my gosh, there's a perfect example right here in front of me.
Yeah, right. Well, it's kind of like, so, and I can buy into that, right? We can all, that's what kind of Stringfellow gets into. We can spend, so I can devote my life to kind of, this institution, and I can pour myself into it. I get all these self-esteem benefits. I'm getting blue ribbons. I'm getting promotions. I'm getting a pat on the back. But at the end of the day, when, if my institution or any business starts feeling kind of the Darwinian pinch, people get let go, and they go, wait a second, think about this last recession, right? I spent 40 years, working for this company, and then just like that, they let me go. And then you look back on it and go, what was I serving? Because what you eventually realize is that institution is governed by its own survival ethic. It's governed by the logic of death. And so I was just serving another, in the language of Paul, another creature, another created thing, and it sapped my time and my energy, and but for 40 years working for the man, it made me feel like my life had purpose and meaning. And it's only when those things, that's where what I was talking about, it being fragile. While it works, it gets you through the day. You can go through the day and be very busy, and feel like you had a good day. But it's very fragile when you face unemployment, or when you kind of face retirement, or when you just kind of face a moment in your life and you say, why am I doing this? What's the point of it? And it's not to deny that what I do, where if somebody even is working at McDonald's, cannot do good work. What we're talking about here is when their identities get wrapped up into that work, because they're hoping that this entity, this institution or ideology will somehow that it will be unaffected by death, and therefore by serving it, I will have achieved some sort of a vicarious immortality. But that's where Ecclesiastes comes in and says, that's vanity.
Yeah, and I think, Richard, and what you're saying, you bring out a good point, because it's so easy to laugh at the example of selling more chicken nuggets as giving you meaning and significance. That's really an easy one to pick on. But, the Beyond the Box podcast can become a really easy way of trying to gain meaning and significance. The more listeners you get, the more downloads you get, the more comments you get, the more Facebook likes you get. All of those things have a tendency, if you're not careful, to make you feel a sense of identity that really isn't based in God. It's just it could even be about God, but it's not based in God. And you really brought this out, I thought, beautifully when you talked about writing a book. And I think working in the Christian industry, the book industry myself, I can see this over and over again with authors. You write a book, and there is satisfaction in that, and there should be satisfaction in that work. But so many times it becomes your identity, to where you don't put your pants on the same way. You don't have to go to the bathroom anymore like everybody else. It's this thing of, now I'm something important. And maybe there's a beauty in those simpler examples, because it's actually so easy to see, I can't base my identity in this, because the culture is always kind of kicking me down for having this menial job or this menial task. There's almost a blessing in that that you lose as you climb the corporate ladder, because it becomes so much easier to invest yourself in your work and think that somehow there's an immortality that kicks in at the end.
Yeah, I mean, now that I'm hearing you think about that, I mean, I wonder about if that's why there's a focus on the poor, and how the poor seem to have a better sense of what God's up to. And it might be because they're living a little closer to the bone, and therefore can see. And I think William Stringfellow in his work would argue this. They see what death is doing much more directly. They're not able to cover it over with, like you said, these kind of the trappings of success can hide the fact that at the end of the day, you can't leave any, you can't take any of that with you. But let me go back to what you're saying about like the podcast. Like, so obviously I'm a blogger, right? So, it's not just that I'm building a sense of identity that's maybe not in God. It also leads to sinful practices. And so to connect with the part one, when we were talking about rivalry, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, I'm a blogger, so I look at other blogs that are more popular or get more comments. And so what happens is I find myself in a rivalrous situation, because their success is some way diminishing me. And so therefore I want to somehow compete with that, and I want to push further. And so it's not just that I'm placing my identity in my blog. It's that my identity in my blog makes me inherently envious, and jealous, and rivalrous, and competitive, and negative towards other human beings. And so that's kind of that thing we were talking about last podcast, how this death-based identity eventually brings me into a sinful state of affairs. So it's not just that I'm neurotic, it's just that I'm inherently aggressive towards others. I don't want people to be more successful than I am.
Yeah, because I mean, that's the thing, is when, it almost seems kind of benign when you just, at the beginning, when you just start describing these neurotic fears, because it's like, well, if our situation really is that grave, then maybe it is better to cover it up. Maybe it is better to go for the gold watch at the end of 30 years of service and go for the book deal. And maybe it is better, but that's where it becomes a big deal. Is this idea that it's not just about getting puffed up, but it's that it goes back to, like you said, the last podcast, where the natural social condition of mankind is war, be that nuclear war, be that trench warfare, or be that just the simple, I want to put up bigger Christmas lights than my neighbor down the street,
right.
Anything that brings us into rivalry. Now, in saying that, you really, you brought out the work of Arthur McGill, which I wasn't familiar with him, and what he talked about with eccentric identity. And this just absolutely blew me away. I'd like to read just kind of, let me see. Well, actually, I thought I had a quote here. I don't have a quote, but you talked about that, the eccentric identity is the opposite of the identity of possession. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about the difference between having an identity of possession and an eccentric identity?
Yeah. McGill's argument in a book, I think it's called Death and Life in American Theology. And his basic argument is that because of death, we feel like the only way we can fend death off is to possess and own and dominate some part of reality. And so that makes us inherently acquisitive. It makes us inherently paranoid that people are going to take things away from me. So my whole identity is based upon what I possess, own, and dominate. And that puts me into this aggressive or violent situation with other people. And I think we described that pretty well last podcast. So the question is, if that's the root of a sinful identity and a satanic identity, then what he does is he looks at the Gospels of Jesus, and he comments on how Jesus, we don't get a lot of like interior monologues with Jesus. There's a sense like you don't get a lot of what was going on inside of him.
No thought bubbles.
Yeah, no thought bubbles. And And his argument was because the reason why we don't get a sense of the interior life of Jesus, because Jesus constantly says that his identity is received by or from the Father. And so since Jesus does not possess anything, not even himself, he stands in no aggressive or violent relationship with any other human being. You can't dispossess Jesus of anything. You can't take anything away from him. And ultimately, and I think in part of this, well, one symptom of this is that means Jesus can fundamentally be non-anxious around people. He is relaxed around people. You can't threaten Jesus, and nothing you can do, no success, no, your success won't make Jesus envious. You couldn't, Pilate threatens him with death, and Jesus, still not anxious. And so McGill argues that his lack of anxiety is due to the fact that he doesn't own himself and receives his identity from God. So his identity is not based internally, but it's based externally, which is that idea of an eccentric identity, an identity based on the outside of the self, in this place, based on God. And so that's a pivotal move in the series, because it's trying to kind of move into more of a positive direction, to argue about if we're going to learn how to love people, we're going to have an identity that isn't built upon anxiety. And that vision of McGill's vision of that kind of, he calls it an ecstatic or an eccentric identity, is one way to think about it, overcoming that anxiety.
You brought out something when you talked about Jesus's eccentric identity that really hit me, because one of the big things we've talked about on this podcast in the last couple of years is the idea of nonviolence. That Steve and I, my co-host on the podcast, we've really come to completely believe that God is completely nonviolent,
right?
And that therefore that's the call, that one of the big calls of discipleship is to an ethic of nonviolence. And that's been a pretty controversial stance to take, especially in the American South. I mean, we have listeners all over that maybe that's not as big a deal for them, but in the American South, that is a really big deal. You talk about, because of Jesus's eccentric identity, that is actually what enabled him to be nonviolent. Is that because of basically not only is his identity outside of himself, but because his identity is outside of himself, and therefore he doesn't have an identity of possession, he has nothing left to lose? I mean, is that kind of the idea of why that's leads to his nonviolence?
Yeah, that's what I argue, because it goes back to kind of what we had talked about last podcast about perfect love casting out fear. He can love, and he can give his life away, because he's not. And it's not to say, and I get into this later on in the series, it's not to say that because quickly when we start moving in these nonviolent directions, people say, so you should just throw your life away. I mean, is there no value to life at all? Shouldn't you protect life and things like that? But it's not necessarily to say that you might choose to live. The question is, what's the motivation? But because if you're making a choice for self-preservation or any other choice based on fear, you're just not going to have, good outcomes, or Christianly outcomes from that. Again, that choices out of fear are going to be kind of Darwinian choices that you're making. But yeah, so since Jesus is not operating out of fear, he's in a non-rivalrous, non-violent, non-aggressive position to any other human being. And that means even if, Pilate says, don't you know I have the power to kill you? I have the power to set you free. That's not a threat to Jesus. There's nothing in that. And see, this goes back to what we were talking about last podcast again. Remember, it's Satan uses the fear of death to push us around. And so you see Pilate in that instance saying, hey, he's using the fear of death. Don't you know I have the power to kill you? To push or bully or get Jesus to do something. But because Jesus is not afraid, Pilate has no leverage on him. And so Jesus's self-donation, his self-giving is motivated out of love. It's not motivated out of fear. He's not cowed into giving his life away. He's not, intimidated into giving his life away. He can make that choice. And so in many ways, he's free. And so that's why love is also associated with the sense of freedom, because we are able to make choices without being compelled. There's have you seen, what is that movie, of Gods and Men, about the monks in that city? It was in the Middle East. I don't know, it was Albania I'm thinking of, but it was a recent, based on a true life story where they were in a kind of a predominantly Muslim country, and fundamentalism was taking over, and so there was a lot of persecution of Christians was breaking out. So a small band of these Christian monks, 5 or 6 of them, had to make a decision to stay or leave, and this is based on a true story. They decide to stay, and there's a really poignant scene in the movie where the leader of the monastery is talking to one of the older guys about, maybe we should go, maybe it's in our self-preservation to just leave, and because it's getting kind of dangerous for us Christians. But they ultimately decide to stay. But in this one scene, the guy says, and the reason why he says is because I'm a free man. I can choose to stay. I'm not doing it out of fear. So it's a great scene that kind of illustrates a lot of what the series is all about. Is that if you can transcend that fear, you can actually make a loving choice. And that might actually mean nonviolently giving your life away.
Yeah.
So,
but that really, without that freedom, you don't have that choice. You just as you were talking, just a connection a synapse just kind of flashed through my brain that kind of made a connection. That scripture where Jesus says, "No one can take my life from me. I have the power to lay it down and the power to take it up again that I've received from my Father." That really is the perfect example of eccentric identity, is this idea that if I don't possess my life, you can't possess it either.
Right.
You can't take it away. And so anything I do is simply a surrender to the will of God. Kind of when Jesus does finally go to the cross, that Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. That he's kind of expressing his trust in the fact that I don't have to watch my back. I don't have to get into the Darwinian struggle, because my Father's going to do that for me, because my interest is Father's interest. There's not this separation there.
Yeah, and I would say that final move of Jesus is the perfect expression of his identity. Into your hands I give my spirit. And because his identity and his spirit rested with the Father, and he had faith in the Father, then he could die. And that's, in many ways, that's the pivotal decision that we all face moment by moment.
As we're talking about this, and I know we're going to harp on this over and over again throughout the series, because like you said last night, or on the last podcast, which was for us last night, you said that really the only theological conversation, when it comes down to it, is between fear and love. And I'm realizing more and more that, at least for so much of my life, my own theology was driven by fear, that you just realize that is such a seismic shift, because it affects every decision we make, everything we believe about ourselves, everything we believe about God. I just can't overstate how important what you're saying is. I know 1 John says it, perfect love casts out fear, but sometimes we don't realize that. I would almost go to the point of saying anything, well, I think I would go to the point of saying this, anything that we do out of a motivation of fear, even if it's service to God, is out of a wrong motive and can actually lead to sin.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I'm kind of
Well,
feeling from the series.
yeah, and I would think kind of what you were saying earlier about, Peter Rawlins's book Insurrection, and he talks about the Deus Ex Machina, and that's I think it's Latin for the God of the machine, and it refers to how in Greek plays they would, whenever the plots got so convoluted and there would be no way to resolve the plot, they would just drop in God, a deity, and the deity would kind of wave a magic wand, and then everything would get better. So if somebody died, the God would bring him back to life, and so he just kind of fixed everything. And so his argument in that book, and Ernest Becker would make a similar argument, is that obviously these, like you were talking about, the cultural value systems of America and the mythology of America, is that that's intimately tied up with God and religion, in that one of the things I do in this series is talk about how, in many ways, what we name as God is really not God. Is really, again, this projection in the sky to help us overcome our death anxiety, and so in many senses it's an idol, and which connects with what you just said, is that's probably why there's so much fear involved in religion, because it's still trapped by the slavery of the fear of death. And that's the hardest and scariest part, is to think about, to question the ways in which we have used God as a anxiety buffer, or even as a part of our self-esteem project.
Definitely. And in talking about this, with this Jesus, his eccentric identity, how we're to kind of gain from that example and follow in the footsteps. You talked a little bit about the renunciation of winning, and the fact that I don't need to win, the fact that the winning and the losing. Does this also kind of play into some of our senses of boundaries? Not only the winning and losing, but the us and the them.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that I don't have to draw these tight boundaries around my space and define who's in, who's out, because if God owns my identity, then it's kind of, all truth is God's truth, for lack of a better term, that everything that's beautiful, anything that smells of God, I don't have to put it to a theology test. Can you talk a little bit about that, the renunciation of winning?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be said. Let me connect it to what you're talking about with the boundaries and the insiders and the outsiders, because the Ernest Becker's follow-up book to The Denial of Death is a book called Escape from Evil, and in it he makes a kind of tragic conclusion. He argues that if these worldviews, these cultural value system worldviews, are what give us meaning and they give us significance, the trouble with that is that when our worldview and our value systems come into conflict with somebody who holds other values and another worldview, they are inherently a threat, because their mere existence suggests that there are many ways of life. There's many ways there's many values, there's many different kinds of gods, and it suddenly makes us realize that, well, maybe my whole worldview and my God and all the projects of self-esteem in my culture are arbitrary, and maybe they're not eternal, or maybe they don't confer immortality like I was led to believe, and that's scary. And so what we do in the language of some researchers in psychology who work in a theory called terror management theory, they describe what we do next as worldview defense. And so in worldview defense, in the face of that implicit criticism by outgroup members, we denigrate outgroup members and support our in-group members. And so Becker concludes that book by saying that's the tragedy of the human predicament, is that the things that make life meaningful, our value systems, are the things that inexorably bring us into conflict and violent situations with those who do not share our values.
Mm.
And so there's always going to be these violent clashes of worldviews. So again, you're saying it goes back to what you were saying about the natural state of man being one of war. But this is not like a fighting over the breadcrumbs.
Right.
This is a violence that's brought about by a neurotic fear that my value system is being criticized, and we find that existentially unsettling. And so, war here is being produced by ideological clashes, and I think that's very important for Americans to hear about how these ideological clashes, value systems are coming into play, and how we demonize outgroup members. I think you see it in American political discourse with the way there's kind of an ideology on the left and there's an ideology on the right, and both of them are kind of messianic in the way they demand loyalty, and so therefore the other side are a group of infidels, which is why I think there's so much anger and anxiety about the American political debate. And so therefore there's this need to win the next election, to get that other guy out, our guy in. We got to win. And the question is why? What are you trying to win? Because beneath it, again, is that messianic sense that, we can do it. We can build a society that will last forever. See, I think we're tricking ourselves into thinking we're building Zion here, on earth. And that's not to say we shouldn't try to make the kingdom come
sure.
earth. I am saying though that is God's doing and not our own. And so, but I think you can only step out of the process of winning by renouncing the ways we strive for significant self-esteem. Because otherwise, if somebody does something differently, we're always going to feel that that's a criticism and therefore want to defend our way of life.
Yeah, you talk about how self-esteem is really how it's idolatry. It's serving the powers. It's how because of the putting our identity in these things that really are just false gods, that it does bring us into conflict, because it causes us, we think that we're fighting for God. I mean, like if you look at the left and the right now, so many times both of them think that they're fighting for God, and they both will use God language, to kind of cover that up, which really it's really just a dupe. I don't know of a better way to say it. It's just really a dupe, and it taps into, I think what you're saying in this series is, it taps into those existential fears and kind of gives us a cause, because we're always looking for a cause. We're always looking for something to fight for, because once again, we think, okay, well, I might be gone in 50, 60, 70 years, but this cause is going to live on, right, be it the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, whatever it is.
And I think, and obviously the one that seems the most transcendent is the nation, right? That America will be around, forever. But, Rome thought it was going to be around forever, it was around. That's right. And it was a great shock to everybody at that time when it fell. It seemed like the world was coming to an end, and I have no idea what's going to be around in 500 or 1,000 years, but again, goes back to what Stringfellow says. America is a part of the created order. It's a part of the fall. And so to serve it is to serve the creature, not the creator. And so that, I think, is I think that's the trap we get into. I think that's why God and country get so conflated. The country, the project of the nation is the dominant mythology that we want to attach ourselves to, because that seems the most long lasting. Yeah. Because you see the mythology, right? We see the honoring of our history. It seems this thing seems to be pretty permanent. So we could, if we attach it, we feel like we've contributed to this thing, then somehow I will, be able to survive death itself.
And it seems like we really do that even maybe with something that we think is more long lasting, even with Christianity itself. I mean, like, living in North Carolina last week, there was the whole fight for the vote over Amendment 1, which was whether or not to, add a clause to the Constitution that banned gay marriage. And, to hear a lot of Christians talk in that debate, it was something we had to win, because a loss in this particular vote would be a loss in the kingdom of God. So it gets so conflated that God gets so, we don't even realize that our God that we think we're serving and calling Jesus and worshiping and all of this kind of thing, and even reading into our Bible, more eisegesis than exegesis,
right?
That's actually just extending the idolatry, and not that it's not true religion at all. You touched a minute ago, Richard, on terror management theory.
Uh-huh.
And I know I watched a fascinating documentary. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I know you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about.
I know the documentary. I don't know the name of it though, but
it came out 2003 or so. I'll have to put that in the notes on the podcast. But anyway, fascinating document on terror management theory, and they showed some examples of some studies that had been done that kind of prove these things. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe give us some ideas of how this has been proved in the lab?
Yeah. These are the researchers, Solomon, Pazinski, and Greenberg are kind of the three leading guys that have done a lot of this work. And so, one of the hypotheses that they've tested is this worldview defense hypothesis so the argument that Ernest Becker makes is that our cultural worldviews are fundamentally anxiety buffers, ways of fending off death anxiety by attaching our life stories to these overarching transcendent narratives. Well, I mean, how do you prove such a thing? I mean that seems very,
ethereal.
Yeah, right. So they've done, what they do in the studies is they bring people in to a laboratory condition and who kind of have a cultural worldview. So if they're American participants, then obviously their worldview is, the American worldview. And so what they then do is they have a control group, and then they have an experimental group. And the experimental group goes to what's called a mortality salience condition. And in the mortality salience condition, they are asked to reflect upon what it's going to be like if they die. So you write a little essay about, the experience of dying and what do you think is going to happen to you. So essentially they make you aware of your own death and mortality. They prime that. And the other group isn't thinking about that at all. They then engage in a variety of tasks, often engaging with out-group members. And so in one study that was conducted during the first Gulf War, the first war in Iraq, they had American students assessing essays written by ostensibly an Iraqi position in a pro-American. So there's kind of like a pro-American position. There's one that's more critical. And then they're asked to rate the quality of the essay, the intelligence of the essayist. And what they find in these studies is that when mortality is made salient, when you're asked to think about your own death, you become much more derogatory toward any criticism of your worldview. You become more patriotic, more pro-American, and therefore more defensive toward your in-group members. So the
kind of dig your heels in, so to speak.
Yeah, right. So the American say is great, and the guy who wrote it is really, really smart, and he's probably a really good person. And this person that was critical of America, they're dumb and they're not so good person, and it's really not a Will Retton essay. But you don't see the control group do that. And so the evidence there is that when we are made to think about our death, we become we entrench in our ideologies. We want to, in the face of death, we want to believe these things to be true. And that suggests that the reason why we want these things to be true is that we're using them to manage our anxiety. And when our anxiety comes out, we become much more hostile towards out-group members. One study that was of interest to me is that Christian participants go through a mortality salience manipulation, and then they were rating potential job applicants. And these applications were essentially equal. They used procedures to make sure they were all pretty much equal. But the main thing they manipulated is the religion of the applicant. So these were Christian participants rating fellow Christian applicants or a Jewish applicant. And they also included, embedded in the ratings of these applicants, they embedded classic anti-Semitic descriptors of Jews, like, miserly, stingy, and what they found is after the mortality salience manipulation, the Christian participants were more willing to endorse these anti-Semitic descriptions of the Jewish applicant. So again, what you see there is anti-Semitism being tied to a death anxiety. And obviously that's as a Christian psychologist, that's an interesting finding, that I've spent a lot of time, following up on and looking at. But it basically illustrates how our belief systems, even Christianity itself, is really being used not to call us into love, but simply as another form of selfish. I'm using it selfishly. I'm using it for my own anxiety management. And so you can't love if that's the way. If your faith is based on anxiety and fear of death, right? If your religion is motivated by coping with the fear of death, then how are you going to ever become Christ-like? Because anything that makes you anxious is going to bring out these hostile actions towards other people.
So it ends up basically that Christianity just becomes about it really becomes about this us-them thing, and making sure that we protect ourself and our stuff and our beliefs and basically our identity from the demonized other, from the threat of the other. And so instead of it becoming about the fact that Jesus came to save the world, to love the world, to teach us how to love the world, that instead, I'm wondering if that's where, and I hope in doing this, I'm not demonizing another group in the name of trying to keep that from happening.
Yeah, it's always tricky.
It's so easy to do that.
Yeah.
But you have to wonder if that's not where this whole battle over stringently fundamentalist understandings of creeds and doctrines. So it's almost like we've got to protect ourselves. We've got to define the boundaries to make sure we don't let anybody in that's not safe, when it seems like Jesus was doing the exact opposite. I mean, he's being accused as being the friend of sinners, and he's hanging out with prostitutes. And, to me, what you're saying is, it's actually pretty darn scary to think that the average Christian, that would be our average response, without being aware of it and without learning some way to go against the flow of this thing, that's really just a natural reaction that even believers in Jesus would have. Now, in saying that, one thing you touched on under your section on terror management that really struck me was the way you talked about doubt, and how doubt was such an integral part of our faith. That doubt is really the source of tolerance. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know we've set up the problem of cultural heroics, the problem of those cultures coming into conflict. How does doubt in our own belief system kind of help us to be more tolerant of others and help us to open ourselves more to love?
Mm-hmm. Well, it goes to the issue again of worldview defense, because the worldview defense is motivated by a fear that the other, and this capital O other, relativizes my belief system, that they are a threat to my belief system. And so what happens is that anxiety makes me fundamentalist. And you're kind of seeing that in the world today, right? There was this sense that, after the Enlightenment, that there's this great march towards reason, and everybody would become real, and we haven't seen that. I mean, I think most people would say that one of the things we're struggling with the most in modernity is fundamentalisms.
Yeah.
All kinds of fundamentalism.
Be that liberal or conservative.
Right, right. And so the question is, well, why is that? Why would modernity make us more fundamentalistic? And the terror management people would say, because in modernity, when you're dealing with pluralism of worldviews, that's a really disconcerting thing. When you have Muslims interacting with Jews, interacting with Christians, interacting with all these kinds of people, it kind of makes you just question who's right. Who is anything right? And so it's really comforting when somebody comes along and says, I'll tell you what's right. This is the truth. This is God's truth, and it's as clear as day. And there is and you and I, both of us have experience with kind of conservative Christianity. There is a comfort in knowing you're right. And
there's a comfort in having the answers.
Exactly. There's a comfort in having, and there's a comfort in knowing you're going to heaven and everybody else is going to hell. It's real sad, those poor people, but there's an existential comfort in knowing that you are part of the in group on that. And so, but it's still, again, fear driven at the end of the day. And so therefore creates those hostile fundamentalist reactions about out-group members, that kind of the Christians that we see that don't seem very loving, but seem very hateful. And so how are we going to be hospitable to out-group members? And the only way to be hospitable is to be willing to allow their views, their lives, their things to put ours, to come alongside ours. And so that experience of being willing to entertain their view creates the experience of doubt. But so you're trading off your certainty for more anxiety. There's a price to pay, with doubt, and that is you don't have all the answers, and you perhaps don't know what's going to happen when you die as certainly as you once did. But you're willing to trade off. You're willing to undergo that anxiety and lack of certainty to be nonviolent toward the person who believes differently than you do. And fundamentally, that means respecting them and actually legitimately listening to them and undergoing the risk of them educating you. That's existentially scary. And most people aren't willing to allow that to happen. You're not really going to listen to somebody from another world religion. It's too threatening.
Right.
But those who can and willing to endure the anxiety of it are probably in a better position to be loving towards those people. And that's not to say that if you believe strongly that you can't be a loving, welcoming person.
Sure.
I'm just saying though that the thirst for existential certainty that we see kind of manifested in kind of a dogmatic or fundamentalist Christianity is probably not the route to being the most loving, compassionate person in a pluralistic society.
Yeah, I think so much of it, when it comes right down to it, I think there are a lot of loving fundamentalists. I was once a loving fundamentalist. I loved people, but I think that there's something about it that at the end of the day, when you are pushed when you are backed into a corner, you will ultimately choose your doctrine over people. You'll choose your belief system over people because it's a safety thing. It's a fear thing, If you making sure you've got all your theological I's dotted and T's crossed is how you get your entrance into heaven, then, there is an existential threat to, at the end of the day, having a conversation or being engaged with someone else. I mean, I've even had, I've had people tell me, you've got to be careful who you talk to. You got to be careful who you read, kind of trying to rein me back in, so to speak, because there's this fear that if you even have contact with the other, that somehow you'll be contaminated. And at this point, I know we're talking about the slavery of death, but I just have to put a plug in for your book, Unclean. We've got to do a podcast on that sometime, Richard.
All right.
But just to kind of tease it out a little bit and hopefully get people to look more into this. you do such good work in that book of actually really addressing this subject of boundaries and borders, and kind of how we tend to demonize the other, how we tend to try and maintain our purity by maintaining our borders. I just really want to encourage people, if you want to dig into this a little bit deeper, they really need to pick up your book, Unclean. Great book. And like I say, I'm going to twist your arm and hopefully do another podcast with you on that sometime.
Oh, let's talk about it. Yeah. And there is some connections in that. I mean, that last part of Unclean gets into the relationship of purity and death and mortality. So there are connections there.
Definitely.
I always joke, everything I eventually write comes back to some connection with existential anxiety or death issues or whatever. So I don't know if it's...
Well, like you said, if the theological conversation is fear and love,
yeah.
And at the end of the day, all of our books got to end there somewhere, right?
Yeah. So
speaking of ending in fear and love, part 3, we're going to get into perfect love, casting out fear, and hopefully kind of tie this all together for everyone so that we see not just, I feel like we've really unpacked what the problem is, and we've kind of put our fingers on the pulse of what the problem is, but maybe we can talk a little bit more creatively about solutions and maybe living into a truly Christian identity in the next podcast. So hopefully you guys can join us for that one. Richard, thanks a lot for joining us for this one. Appreciate all your input, brother.
You got it.
Man, oh man. Good stuff. I hope you enjoyed this conversation half as much as I did. Just so many great ideas that Richard brings out in this podcast. Gosh, I just want to encourage you guys, if you get a chance to read the book Unclean that we mentioned in this podcast, really, really great stuff. Richard has just done a great job of really helping us understand the difference between mercy and sacrifice, and how those two trajectories that we see in the Bible really don't intersect very well. Really, really encourage you to go get the book. And please join us for part 3 of this podcast. I think it'll really tie a lot of things together and just kind of make sense of the whole thing for you. Richard, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. Thoroughly enjoyed our conversations. Look forward to many more in the future. Just really, really appreciate your insight into so many things. And guys, I just really appreciate all of you who listen. Thank you so much for taking the time to stick us in your ears, to stick us in your car, on your computer at work, wherever you listen. I just so appreciate you taking the time to really hear a lot of these ideas that for many of us, I know for me, many times are very new and sometimes feel novel. But thank you guys for joining us and taking the time to really think through a lot of these issues that we talk about. I know we're not always going to agree on everything, and I am completely okay with that. I just so appreciate the fact that you guys would take the time to not only listen, but also interact with us. If you want to do that, we've got several great ways for you to interact with us. You can go to the homepage, our website, which is beyondtheboxpodcast.com. You'll see all of our previous episodes on that website. You'll also see this episode. If you want to interact with this episode or any previous episode, you can put your comments there, your questions, your disagreements, anything you want to put. We welcome your feedback and we welcome your interaction. Also, if you go to Facebook, Facebook's probably the best place to dialogue with just a great community of people that have really just really developed into a spiritual community for me over the last 4 years. That website is facebook.com/beyondthebox. You'll see we post all of our podcast episodes there, so you can interact with the podcast episode on the thread that you see where you can actually listen to the episode. Like I say, put your disagreements, your questions, your comments, whatever you would like to interact with on there, feel free to do so. Also, if you've got something that's been on your mind that you've been thinking about, we would love for you just to start a thread on that Facebook page and just let people interact with you. It's a great, safe place to interact about just controversial theological issues, or maybe a question that you've had regarding Scripture that you'd like to kind of put out there for the community to kick back and forth. We just really welcome your input there, and just hope that you'll find that a safe place to interact with other believers who are on this journey outside the box. Now, you can also, another thing we'd love for you to do is to put your idea submissions. we have a great page on our website that just says idea submissions at the top. If you click that, you can leave a comment, maybe for a future podcast episode that you'd like to see us do, maybe a person that you'd like to see us interview, or a topic that you'd like Steve and I to talk about. We'd love to hear your interaction. As you probably well know, if you've listened to the podcast for very long, we don't always take every idea, not because they're not great, but sometimes because we don't know if we're qualified to really talk about it, or maybe it's something that we've not thought through. So sometimes you guys are ahead of us, which I really appreciate. But we'd love to get your idea submissions there. Now, another great thing we'd love you to do is you can call our telephone number, which is a neat way to kind of leave a voice comment that we can either play on the podcast, or you can do it just personally for me and Steve to hear, as a way to kind of put your comment out there without having to sit down in front of a computer and type. Maybe you're driving down the road and you have just an epiphany that you'd like to share. Well, pull off on the side of the road and dial our phone number, and you can leave a comment, and we'll be glad to share it with our listeners. That number is 626-24-NO-BOX. That's 626-246-6269. 626-246-6269. Now, if you don't want to call the number, you can actually go to beyondtheboxpodcast.com, and you'll see a little widget on the right-hand side that says Call Me. If you click that, type your name and phone number in there and hit submit, then our answering service will actually call you back and let you leave a message without you having to call us. So that's another great way to interact with us. If you want to sign up for our Twitter feed, which basically just posts when we have new episodes up, or maybe when we post something on the Facebook page, you can go to twitter.com/BTBpodcast, and that'll get you hooked up with our Twitter feed. I just thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen once again. Thank you so much for your interactions. Love you guys. Appreciate you guys. I just thank you so much for joining us on this journey as we travel outside the box. Dr. Richard Beck, you are the man. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this podcast with us. Can't wait for you guys to hear part 3. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great week.